Hello, I'm Mia. My own mother uninvited me from my sister's graduation. Just like that, left out. Humiliated, while everyone else cheered. But it wasn't just about missing a ceremony. Every smile they flashed, every whispered compliment for her, it cut deeper than words. I held my silence until I saw the truth, and what I did next made her smile vanish first. How far would you go when the people who should protect you betray you completely? The morning sunlight spilled into our Houston kitchen, but it did nothing to warm the pit forming in my stomach. There they were, stacked neatly on the counter, graduation invitations. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for one, only to notice it had no name, just a blank space where my identity should have been. Sarah's invitation, on the other hand, gleamed in polished elegance, her name bold and proud in perfect script. I traced the edges with my fingers, inhaled the crisp scent of the paper, and felt a wave of disbelief and hurt wash over me. Why am I invisible again? Haven't I done enough? I muttered under my breath, my mind already logging this for later. The first echo of a long-standing exclusion taking root. Every subtle design choice screamed favoritism, every curve of the envelope whispering her mother's approval. As I lingered, I overheard them, Muriel leaning towards Sarah, her voice low but unmistakably deliberate. "It's better if Mia isn't in the spotlight this year," she said, and my heart sank. I froze, the words sharp as knives, slicing through the morning calm. I felt the stirrings of strategic thought forming, a quiet catalog of evidence, gestures, and whispered schemes that would not escape my notice. I knew now that this wasn't oversight, it was deliberate. Memories flooded back, birthdays overlooked, small achievements ignored, holidays passed with my presence almost an afterthought. Sarah basked in acknowledgement, while my quiet efforts dissolved into thin air. The pattern was undeniable. Favoritism, erasure, invisibility, anger simmered beneath my composed exterior. I've been patient. How long do I let this go unnoticed? I thought, my mind rehearsing controlled responses, plotting future moves. I lingered at the edge of the kitchen, watching every glance, every tilt of the head, every micro-expression between mother and sister. I made mental notes, seating arrangements, tone, subtle gestures of inclusion or exclusion. I held back my voice, my body calm, yet inside, my resolve solidified. I'll act, but timing will decide how they'll see me, I reminded myself. Patience and observation had become my allies, intelligence, my quiet weapon. And then, my fingers brushed against the nameless invitation again, the texture, a tangible reminder of exclusion, a symbol I would carry forward, an emotional anchor that would pay off later. The blank space where my name should have been was no longer just a slight, it was a warning, a challenge, a seed for future reckoning. I felt my determination harden. I would watch, I would learn, and when the moment came, I would act with precision. The morning passed, yet I remained tethered to that stack of invitations, a silent witness to the favoritism that had gone unchecked for far too long. Every movement of Muriel, every smile at Sarah, every whispered comment was catalogued, stored for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. I understood now that their underestimation of me was their greatest mistake. Link to next chapter. I had to ask myself, if they've erased me from this celebration, what else have they written me out of? I lingered near the hallway, pretending to search for something in a small side table, while my mother spoke to Sarah in the living room just beyond. Their voices carried, soft enough that someone unobservant might have missed the undertone, but I caught every inflection. "Everyone knows Sarah should shine this year," Muriel said, with a pause that made the words sting more than any accusation. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of unease and suspicion settling like a weight I couldn't shake. They were planning it, the seating, the attention, the little gestures that would make Sarah the center, while I faded into the background. I noticed how Sarah nodded, not out of malice but compliance, a quiet acceptance of privilege, as if this pattern was the way things were meant to be. My mind began mapping out the subtle choreography of exclusion. The reserved seats, the careful placement of relatives, the barely perceptible looks that confirmed who mattered. Every slight movement, every pause in Muriel's voice became data. I could almost see the invisible lines of favoritism drawn through the room, and I cataloged them all silently. I stepped back, letting my presence blend into the shadows, my mind reviewing the years of subtle dismissal. Birthdays when my contributions were overlooked, holidays where my effort went unnoticed, small achievements erased from conversation while Sarah's accomplishments were highlighted. It wasn't just today, it was a continuum, a pattern I was only beginning to fully recognize. Muriel's control wasn't blunt, it was intricate, almost imperceptible if you didn't pay attention. Household staff, minor relatives, everyone seemed to understand the unspoken rules. I realized that understanding came first, before action. There was no need for immediate confrontation. I needed to see the entire board, to track each move, and anticipate their next plays. The frustration simmered quietly, transforming into focus. I would not be caught off guard, not again. As I watched, I saw how even minor guests subtly reinforced the favoritism. Compliments were extended to Sarah, with exaggerated warmth. My presence was acknowledged politely, but minimally, as if my role was merely functional. Every word, every gesture from those around them reinforced the hierarchy. A hierarchy I had never consented to but had been expected to endure silently. I felt the sting of invisibility again, but this time it fueled calculation rather than despair. The envelope from yesterday, the nameless invitation, lingered in my thoughts, an emblem of deliberate oversight, a signal that the family operated with precision in maintaining appearances. I committed the scene to memory, noticing glances exchanged, pauses held, hands gestured delicately, all tools in their subtle manipulation. By mid-morning, I had moved back into the living room, a silent observer sitting slightly apart, cataloging and mentally rehearsing responses. I imagined different scenarios, what I could say, how I could interject, when it would have the most impact without provoking suspicion prematurely. Timing mattered more than volume, strategy more than emotion. I reviewed ethical boundaries, conscious that overt aggression would only play into Muriel's and Sarah's hands. I traced the subtle cues, the soft footstep that indicated Sarah was about to speak, the tilt of Muriel's head that suggested judgment, and imagined how I could leverage these moments later. In a quiet corner of my mind, I began assembling a dossier, not on paper, but in thought, carefully storing evidence of favoritism, whispers, gestures, and choices that painted a picture of the family's calculated hierarchy. The symbolic gestures didn't escape me. A chair slightly forward for Sarah at the breakfast table, a napkin folded with her initials instead of mine, the way minor relatives deferred questions to her small, almost inconsequential moves that signaled who was valued. I absorbed each one, letting the weight of recognition settle. I was not powerless. I was simply unseen. Cataloging, understanding, preparing. The tension in the room was almost tangible. A quiet hum of anticipation that only I seemed to notice. Their obliviousness to my awareness fueled my internal resolve. I understood that the smallest gestures, the quietest words, could unravel what they thought was unshakable. And in that realization, I felt the first stirrings of control not over them, but over the knowledge of their pattern, and through that, the possibility of my own measured response. Every glance exchanged, every whispered comment, added to a mental map that would guide future actions. I saw potential leverage points, the subtle lapses in their carefully constructed narrative. Patience, timing, and observation had become my allies. As the morning light shifted across the living room, casting familiar shadows over familiar furniture, I made silent notes to myself. Record, wait, observe, and act when the moment demanded precision. The strategic mind within me was awakened, quiet but unrelenting, aware of both the injustice and the pathways toward redress. I would not allow invisibility to define me, nor subtle manipulation to dictate my presence in family life. I would act, and the timing of that action would define everything. The morning had stretched into late hours, and I found myself moving between the living room and dining area, careful to remain unobtrusive while observing the subtle signals weaving through the room. Every glance, every whispered remark, every tilt of a head seemed calculated to reinforce Sarah's prominence and my own marginalization. A cousin leaned slightly forward when speaking to her, a smile lingering longer than it did for me. A relative in the corner whispered something to another guest, and I caught just enough to note their approval of Sarah's achievements, while my own went unacknowledged. The pattern was unmistakable. and it made my chest tighten, not in despair, but in the quiet awareness that I was seeing the architecture of exclusion laid bare. I drifted closer to the dining area and discovered the seating plan tucked discreetly on a clipboard. My name was placed at the edge, a position chosen so that I would witness all the interactions without being part of the central flow. The plan wasn't a mistake. Every chair, every proximity, every slight gap had been designed with intention. I felt that familiar sting of quiet frustration, tempered by the resolve that this was information I could use. I examined the plan carefully, noting who would sit near Sarah, who would offer her compliments, and who would defer to her quietly. Timing would be essential in any action I decided to take. Understanding the moves before executing them became a mental exercise, measuring patience, weighing ethics, and planning subtle interventions. The room hummed with ordinary conversation, unaware that I was cataloging every minor interaction, every unspoken rule, every hidden judgment. As I sat back slightly, I replayed scenarios in my mind. What could I say? How could I position myself without causing an outright confrontation? I considered the power structures, Muriel's subtle control over the room, Sarah's passive compliance, and the peripheral observers who reinforced these patterns without realizing it. Each mental rehearsal honed my focus and sharpened my perception. I began to see possibilities to expose the favoritism through observation, tact, and timing rather than direct confrontation. Every moment became a strategic note. A laugh too loud, a hand extended too quickly, a glance exchanged across the table, all were signals to guide my next moves. I allowed myself a small act of subtle defiance, engaging politely with a relative who had routinely overlooked me, initiating brief conversation and observing their reaction. Their surprise was minimal, but enough to register that my presence could no longer be ignored entirely. I noticed how Sarah's smile faltered slightly when she caught the eye contact, and how Muriel's subtle nod acknowledged my small assertion. No words were exchanged, but a shift had begun, a quiet empowerment, a realization that presence alone, calmly asserted, could challenge the unspoken hierarchy. I cataloged the responses, learning who could be approached later, who might act as an ally, and who would continue their passive support of favoritism. Then, my eyes fell on a small symbol tucked at the end of the table, a chair slightly marked, a subtle placement hinting at my assigned place in the family narrative. It was minor, almost inconsequential to anyone else, but to me, it was a thread in a tapestry I had begun to understand. I stored this detail mentally, knowing it would inform later actions, becoming a focal point for the echo-emotional anchor I had begun establishing with the nameless invitation. Every whispered judgment, every rearranged seat, and every subtle approval was part of a larger plan, and for the first time, I could see the entire pattern. The pieces fit together, and with awareness came a strange combination of tension and readiness. I was no longer merely observing. I was learning, anticipating, and preparing. I leaned back against the wall, feeling the subtle shift in my own posture, the calm steadiness that contrasted with the quiet storm of understanding in my mind. The room carried on, oblivious, while I cataloged the positions, the gestures, and the whispered opinions. Each small signal became data, each small smile a clue. I could feel the moment approaching when observation would transform into action, when the quiet accumulation of awareness would be enough to challenge the status quo. I knew that patience, precision, and timing would define the impact of my eventual move. I had begun to see the patterns hiding in plain sight, threads that, when pulled at the right moment, could unravel the carefully constructed narrative around me. Every calculation, every observation, was a step toward reclaiming presence, asserting value, and quietly, deliberately, shifting the perception of those who had overlooked me for too long. The early afternoon sunlight filtered through the living room blinds, casting long stripes across the polished floor as I moved quietly, keeping my distance yet close enough to observe. I had spent the morning cataloging every minor gesture, every hushed comment, and now I was ready to begin a careful, measured assertion of my presence. Muriel and Sarah were unaware that I had absorbed the subtle hierarchy woven into every interaction, and that awareness gave me a calm edge. I noted the seating, the placement of family members, and the minor favors quietly bestowed upon Sarah, recording them mentally like pieces on a chessboard. There was no rush, only the deliberate assessment of who would notice a shift and who would remain blind to it. I chose my first opportunity carefully, interjecting at a moment that required no confrontation yet demanded acknowledgement. A relative mispronounced Sarah's achievement, and I offered a gentle correction, phrased politely, with a smile that held neither challenge nor deference. The room paused, eyes flicking toward me, and I noticed Muriel's subtle tightening of her jaw and Sarah's slight blink of surprise. No one said anything directly, yet the ripple of recognition had begun. I filed their reactions mentally, cataloging what stirred irritation, what was noted silently, and what could be leveraged in later moves. My voice remained calm, the words chosen as markers of presence rather than weapons, yet they carried a quiet weight. The sense of empowerment was subtle, but palpable, as I realized that measured visibility could unsettle the carefully controlled narrative without ever raising my voice in anger. Minor tensions began to surface almost immediately after that small assertion. A cousin made a pointed comment in a low tone, referencing an achievement of Sarah's that I had subtly highlighted earlier. Muriel's nod of approval was barely perceptible, yet it carried the weight of acknowledgement I had been denied for years. My own internal response was a measured calm. I noted the micro-friction, the passive-aggressive comments, the uneasy glances exchanged between family members. There was no overt conflict, but the cracks were beginning to show. I cataloged each subtle shift as data, recognizing which behaviors could be amplified later and which would require caution. Frustration stirred quietly in my chest, tempered by the knowledge that patience would yield a far more powerful outcome than impulsive confrontation ever could. I spent the next hour moving through calculated observations, noting who reacted positively or negatively to my subtle interventions. A minor relative smiled at my measured interjection, a small nod that suggested potential future allyship, while others maintained their neutral facades, their silence betraying nothing but awareness. The nameless invitation and the reserved seat from previous chapters returned to my mind, their symbolism linking past exclusions with the unfolding interactions. Each observation fed my internal strategy, reinforcing my sense of quiet strength and measured intelligence. I understood that control didn't always come from bold moves. Sometimes it came from the patience to watch, wait, and act at the precise moment. Toward the end of the afternoon, a tiny but telling detail caught my attention. A folded program, hastily placed on a chair near the head of the table, marked yet another subtle signal of favoritism. The gesture was small, almost laughably insignificant to anyone else. Yet for me, it was a thread in the pattern I was deciphering. I noted it mentally, feeling a surge of quiet triumph. Awareness itself was a weapon, and I was now armed with enough information to influence the unfolding family dynamics. Timing would be everything, and I intended to wait for the exact moment when even the smallest words or gestures could tilt the balance in my favor. The room moved around me, oblivious to the strategic calculations silently forming, yet I felt a steady surge of anticipation. I was present, acknowledged, and already planning the first subtle moves of change. Late afternoon light spilled into the kitchen, softening the edges of the countertops and casting long shadows across the floor. I moved deliberately, cataloging every detail, replaying conversations and gestures in my mind. The evidence had grown steadily over the past days. The seating plans, the whispered instructions to Sarah, the subtle favors that seemed to be doled out with calculated intention. Each minor slip, each unacknowledged achievement of mine, had been noted and filed mentally. I could feel the quiet weight of it pressing in, not heavy, but focused, like a coil being wound tighter with each observation. Patience was no longer passive. It was preparation. My eyes scanned the room, following Muriel's movements, noting the subtle signals of approval or discomfort, tracing Sarah's automatic, almost practiced smiles. I began mapping potential allies, even in the smallest gestures from relatives or staff who were inadvertently revealing loyalties. Every nuance counted, and I was taking it all in, silently amassing the proof and patterns that would guide my first proactive steps. I spoke softly but deliberately, testing the waters with Muriel and Sarah. My words were precise, indirect references to previous oversights, a carefully chosen tone that suggested both awareness and calm expectation. I noticed that the arrangements for the dinner favor certain spots, I said lightly, letting my gaze linger on the reserved seats. Their reactions were immediate, subtle, yet telling. Muriel's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyebrows raising in mild surprise, while Sarah's eyes flickered with a momentary unease before the usual practiced smile returned. I noted every twitch, every hesitation. The room carried on, but the undercurrent had shifted. My presence, previously invisible or easily dismissed, now carried a measured weight. Inside, I cataloged their reactions for future reference, evaluating how each might bend, resist, or falter under a more directed approach. Quiet control had become my weapon, and the subtle warning planted the first seeds of psychological tension. The atmosphere remained outwardly composed, yet small frictions emerged as I interjected with minor corrections or polite clarifications in shared tasks. A cousin misaligned a serving tray and I offered a soft suggestion, the tone light but firm enough to draw attention. Muriel's raised eyebrows, Sarah's brief pause, tiny fissures in the familial facade. Social tension thickened imperceptibly, and I kept my composure, aware that visible frustration would only give away my hand. This was the first real measure of my ability to command subtle attention without resorting to overt confrontation. It was a delicate dance, enough presence to be acknowledged, yet restrained to avoid provoking a defensive backlash. The room continued, oblivious to the strategic mind quietly shaping the dynamics around every exchange. I observed the reactions keenly, noting who seemed receptive to my interjections and who recoiled into silence. The minor smiles, the fleeting nods, and even the barely perceptible avoidance told me which individuals could be relied upon or leveraged later. The symbolic gestures I had cataloged in previous chapters, the nameless invitation, the periphery seating surfaced in my thoughts, linking past slights to present awareness. I mentally rehearsed next steps, anticipating the escalation that would follow. My patience was measured, yet my anticipation was electric. I knew the first warning had been issued, and the true test would come when those subtle cracks turned into larger openings. This quiet observation, this careful recording of responses, set the stage for more deliberate action. I understood that strategy often required restraint as much as initiative. A small, critical detail drew my attention toward the end of the afternoon. A misfiled note tucked beneath a stack of menus, a tiny, easily overlooked sign that Muriel had again attempted to prioritize Sarah. The gesture, almost invisible to anyone else, spoke volumes to me. I tucked it away in my mind alongside every previous indication of favoritism, a subtle thread to be unraveled at the right moment. The room continued its gentle hum, unaware that the balance had begun to shift imperceptibly. Every glance, every minor word, became a data point. The tension was quiet but tangible. I allowed a faint inward smile to form, recognizing the power of awareness. My silence had never been passive. It had been strategic, and now the first real warnings had taken root. Timing, as always, would determine their impact, and I intended to strike precisely when the moment was ripe. They believed my quiet compliance was weakness, yet it had already set the stage for my first deliberate maneuver. Evening settled over the house, the golden light from the setting sun slipping between the blinds and casting stripes across the dining room floor. I moved with purpose, eyes tracking every shift of expression, every minute adjustment in posture. Muriel and Sarah carried on as though nothing had changed, unaware or perhaps deliberately ignoring the subtle warnings I had planted earlier. Their conversations, their gestures, the casual overlooking of details all revealed the patterns I had grown accustomed to reading. Frustration gnawed at me, but I held it tight, letting it fuel vigilance rather than outburst. Every look, every slight pause, became data, and I stored it meticulously, ready to weave it into my next move. When the moment presented itself, I took it with precision. I spoke, measured, and calm, cutting through the quiet with carefully chosen words that exposed the manipulations without overt confrontation. "It seems some details might have been overlooked," I said, letting my eyes linger on the seating chart and the subtle distinctions. Favoring Sarah. Muriel's eyebrows shot up in faint alarm, her lips tightening in that habitual line of minor disapproval. Sarah's reaction was almost imperceptible, a flicker of unease that she quickly masked with a polite smile. I catalogued every micro-expression, every hesitation. My words had landed, my presence asserted, and yet I remained composed, careful to maintain an air of restraint even as the undercurrents shifted. My mind raced through contingencies, noting who might bend, who might resist, and who would falter if tested further. Beneath the calm exterior, a storm churned. Anger, hurt, betrayal, they were there, hidden from everyone else, locked behind a deliberate mask of composure. Memories of prior slights and overlooked efforts surged, a quiet roar that I controlled with careful breathing. I glanced at the nameless invitation again, the symbol of exclusion that had haunted the past months. It anchored my emotions, reminding me of the necessity for strategy over impulsive reaction. The dissonance between my inner intensity and the outward poise sharpened my awareness. Every glance, every subtle dismissal fueled the internal drive to act deliberately, to plan rather than react, to strike strategically rather than vent. Then came the first tactical countermeasure. A minor misstatement from Muriel, a fleeting overreach by Sarah, provided a crack in their carefully maintained composure. I exploited it subtly, pointing out a small inconsistency with calm precision. The room stiffened. Muriel's jaw tensed. Sarah blinked rapidly, and a few extended family members exchanged uncertain glances. My intervention was quiet, almost invisible to anyone untrained in observation, yet its effect rippled through the atmosphere. I noted who reacted with discomfort, who tried to maintain neutrality, and who could be influenced by the undercurrent I had begun to channel. Each reaction was a building block, a piece of leverage for the moves yet to come. I allowed the moment to pass, satisfied that my first deliberate maneuver had gained traction without escalating beyond control. As the evening drew on, I noticed a subtle but crucial detail tucked away, a note misfiled in the margins of a guest list. A whispered remark caught in the corner of the room that confirmed what I had long suspected. The duplicity ran deeper than overt favoritism. Timing would be everything. I stored this observation alongside the accumulated evidence of prior slights and exclusions, preparing for the next escalation. The family continued, unaware of the silent calculations unfolding behind my measured exterior. I understood that patience had its power, and now, with the first deliberate moves executed, the stage was set for more decisive action. The silence of the room carried tension, a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted, that the balance of control had begun to tilt in subtle, yet unmistakable ways. The next move would cut deeper than words, and I was ready. Night had fallen over Houston, and the house had settled into a deceptive quiet. I retreated to my private study, the soft lamplight illuminating papers and notes I had collected over the past weeks. It was here that I finally uncovered the hidden evidence, documents and messages Muriel and Sarah had thought safely concealed. My breath caught as I traced the patterns of exclusion, the subtle manipulations that had gone unnoticed by everyone else. Betrayal surged through me, but it was tempered by a hard-edged determination. Each revelation tied together previous slights and dismissals, revealing a thread of intent that ran deeper than I had imagined. The shock of realization hardened into a resolve. It was time to act, but strategically, deliberately, with every move planned. I reached out to my confidant, a trusted friend who had known me through quieter, formative years. Sitting across from me, they offered clarity. A mirror reflecting patterns I had glimpsed but could not fully define. Their insight helped me see where I had been blind, where assumptions had led me to inaction, and where subtle cues had been overlooked. I shared the evidence, and together we traced Muriel and Sarah's maneuverings, untangling the web of favoritism and passive compliance. The conversation solidified my confidence, reinforcing the intelligence and strategic patience that had carried me this far. Lessons from past missteps surfaced, reminding me that timing and composure were as crucial as action. I left the discussion with renewed perspective, a clear map of leverage points and vulnerabilities. With that clarity, I began to chart my tactical shift. Each step was calculated: subtle exposures, timed observations, and carefully crafted interactions designed to maintain composure while asserting influence. I considered potential pushback from Muriel, Sarah, and the extended family, anticipating defensive maneuvers and preparing counters. The evidence and small symbolic objects, the invitation, seating notes, and minor overlooked details became tools in my mental strategy, markers that could be deployed to reinforce my position. In silence, I rehearsed tone, pacing, and timing, imagining every expression, every whispered response. The plan was meticulous, a chessboard in my mind where each piece had purpose, and I felt the growing thrill of potential control. Still, emotional tension lingered beneath the surface. Part of me wrestled with the desire for immediate confrontation, a visceral need to reveal all at once. Another part urged patience, waiting for the optimal moment to maximize impact. Flashbacks of previous dismissals, ignored efforts, and subtle humiliations flashed through my mind, each a reminder of the stakes. I felt the weight of years of suppressed indignation and realized that the careful restraint I'd exercised was now a weapon, a strategic edge over those who underestimated me. The internal conflict sharpened my focus, aligning emotion with purpose, ensuring that when action came, it would be precise, controlled, and undeniable. Before the night ended, I identified a vulnerability in Muriel's carefully constructed demeanor, a small crack that could be leveraged to shift dynamics in my favor. Every detail collected, every observation noted, and every reflection on past slights converged to form a singular purpose. The next move would change the trajectory of this household. As I closed my study door, a quiet sense of anticipation settled over me. I was poised at the edge of decisive action, ready to translate months of observation and careful planning into tangible influence. Patience had brought me here. Strategy would carry me forward. I knew the moment to strike was near, and I couldn't afford to wait any longer. The evening air in the living room felt heavier than usual, a weight that settled over the gathered family. I took a steadying breath, recalling every subtle observation, every whispered word, every overlooked slight that had led to this moment. My plan had been rehearsed countless times in my mind, and now, the execution required only composure and precision. I began by addressing Muriel and Sarah with measured words, hinting at the evidence I had collected, the proof of manipulations and favoritism they thought hidden. I watched their faces closely, the slight flinch, the narrowing of eyes, the controlled breaths, and noted each reaction carefully. Small proofs were revealed methodically, enough to create tension without shattering the room, each revelation a calculated step that shifted the atmosphere. I maintained calm, letting the weight of their actions register without losing my own poise. Every glance, every pause, reinforced the suspense. The family could sense the consequences, but not yet the full scope of what I had uncovered. The stage was set, and I was in control, knowing the more dramatic revelation was yet to come. When the time was right, I orchestrated the public unveiling. Family and close friends gathered, unaware of the magnitude of what was about to unfold. I presented the hidden messages, the records, the seating arrangements, all the pieces Muriel and Sarah had tried to conceal. Eyes widened, murmurs spread, and I observed as disbelief gave way to a mix of anger, regret, and humiliation. Muriel's jaw tightened, her attempts to respond faltered, while Sarah's defensiveness became evident in nervous gestures and sharp glances. The room shifted around me. I was no longer a passive observer, but the center of a revelation that demanded attention. The satisfaction was quiet but profound, the mic drop moment building naturally from weeks of observation, preparation, and calculated restraint. I felt a surge of empowerment as the truths I had carried alone now unfolded for all to see, my patience and strategy validated in the most undeniable way. With the truth out, a sense of personal triumph settled over me. I had not only exposed deceit but claimed a space for my voice within the family, demonstrating intelligence, resilience, and control. My confidant offered a nod of quiet approval, a reminder that every decision had been precise and thoughtful. For the first time, I felt the weight of past exclusions lift slightly, replaced with a growing sense of self-worth and validation. This was more than victory. It was an assertion of presence and intellect, a claim that my contributions, my awareness, and my patience mattered. I moved through the room differently, noticing who responded with respect, curiosity, or newfound regard, each interaction reinforcing my strategic approach and the lessons of restraint. As the evening wore on, the fallout among family members became evident. Muriel attempted to rationalize, to maintain authority, but her efforts appeared hollow and unconvincing. Sarah's defensiveness softened into reflection, though tinged with lingering resentment. Others in the household shifted, uncertain how to navigate the new dynamics. I observed quietly, taking note of lingering tensions, small alliances, and potential future challenges. The consequences of their manipulation and dishonesty were now clear, leaving a trail of reflection, shame, and reevaluation. I considered the next steps, both in terms of maintaining boundaries and in possible reconciliation, understanding that the process of change was ongoing. The family would adjust, and so would I, armed with clarity and strategy. Even as the house quieted and the immediate confrontation concluded, I remained aware that some wounds would not heal instantly. The room was subdued, yet charged with unspoken thoughts and simmering emotions. I understood that while the public exposure was complete, the internal dynamics would continue to evolve, requiring patience, observation, and measured action. I sensed that my strategic awakening had shifted the balance, but vigilance remained necessary. The evening had proven that silence was not submission, intelligence was power, and careful planning could yield profound results. The lessons of patience, strategy, and emotional control had crystallized in this showdown, and I knew the work of reclaiming my life was just beginning. The house was quiet now, but I knew some truths take longer to heal than to expose. The morning sun poured through the living room windows, casting long, warm shadows across the hardwood floors. The house, once heavy with tension and unspoken resentments, now felt lighter, though not entirely unburdened. I moved through the space slowly, observing Muriel and Sarah as they navigated the aftermath of the previous night's revelations. There was guilt in Muriel's eyes, hesitation in Sarah's movements, and cautious curiosity from the other family members. I let myself feel a quiet relief, a sense of balance restored, while recognizing that closure would not erase years of subtle exclusion and manipulation. Reflection came naturally. I saw how much I had grown, how patience, intelligence, and careful observation had guided me to this moment. Boundaries had been silently redrawn, and for the first time, I felt a clear sense of my own worth, separate from the distortions of family favoritism. Forgiveness was not immediate, but the awareness of my own resilience was. I took deliberate steps to rebuild relationships, engaging selectively with those family members whose openness allowed cautious reconnection. Conversations were measured, infused with new boundaries yet offering small gestures of compromise. Where mutual respect could be established, I leaned into it, offering recognition and, where appropriate, a gentle nod toward forgiveness. My confidante's presence reminded me to balance optimism with realism, and together, we reflected on the power of measured action over impulsive response. I guided conversations with younger or more vulnerable relatives, sharing insights gained from prior conflicts, showing how awareness and patience could serve as both shield and compass. In doing so, I felt a renewed sense of empathy and quiet leadership within the family, the recognition that growth came not from mere victory but from navigating the complexity of human relationships with intention and intelligence. As the day unfolded, I turned attention to my personal empowerment and future plans. I envisioned professional goals, social engagements, and ways to contribute meaningfully to my own life while applying the lessons learned from familial conflict. Each step was intentional. No revenge, no retribution, only thoughtful, strategic movement toward independence and fulfillment. The experiences of manipulation, exclusion, and subtle injustice had sharpened my understanding, teaching me to anticipate challenges and respond with measured clarity. Even as life continued with its inevitable hurdles, I felt prepared, knowing that strength, intelligence, and emotional control were enduring tools, far more valuable than fleeting victories or hollow apologies. This planning gave me a sense of calm determination, a forward-looking optimism that blended with the lessons of the past. Walking through the outdoor garden later in the afternoon, I allowed myself to fully absorb the sense of resolution. I considered family, relationships, and the larger lessons about trust, respect, and personal boundaries. The echoes of past betrayals were still present, but they no longer dictated my actions. Observing the way sunlight hit the leaves, I reflected on patience and strategy, realizing that they had guided me to this new equilibrium. My thoughts carried the weight of wisdom gained over the course of months of observation, planning, and careful action. Gratitude arose not only for my own growth, but for the clarity that had allowed me to navigate the complex dynamics of those I loved and those I needed to protect myself from. Life, I understood, was a series of choices, and I was now firmly in control of mine. By evening, the family gathered quietly, a tentative harmony settling among us. There was recognition without fanfare, an understanding that while some wounds remained, progress had been made. I sensed an ongoing evolution, subtle yet significant, and I welcomed it. My mind traced the journey from silent observer to strategic participant, from excluded sister to empowered voice. I embraced the calm satisfaction that comes from having navigated treacherous dynamics with intelligence and patience, acknowledging that some scars may linger but no longer held power over my choices. There was a quiet pride in knowing I had acted with discernment, preserving integrity while asserting presence. I finally breathed, knowing the past had shaped me, but it would never define me again.